We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail.
Being an American involves the embrace of high ideals and civic responsibility.
We were looking at a potential disaster as Gaddafi threatened to massacre large numbers of his population. We, along with the UN and others, helped to superintend 2 free and fair elections, something that is still quite an accomplishment by the Libyan people. They chose moderate leaders.
We're at an inflection point between those who argue that given all the challenges we face, from the 4th Industrial Revolution to the global pandemic, that autocracy is the best way forward, they argue. And those who understand that democracy is essential. In the battle between democracy and autocracies, democracies are rising to the moment, and the world is clearly choosing the side of peace and security.
The dichotomy between democracy and autocracy, between democratic and authoritarian states, is an often used rhetorical instrument by the right, and even the left. It is employed to assess and justify geopolitical strategies, in painting democratic states as righteous while labeling those operating outside the rule-based international order as authoritarian. To be sure, there is an undeniable and material difference between autocracy and democracy. A society that condemns its women to servitude and degrades them to the status of commodity is surely less sustainable politically or defensible morally than its progressive counterparts. A country that is ruled by a dynasty rather than by an elected body is almost always closed off to progress, social justice, and basic liberties. But what exactly is a democracy? Is it simply the presence of free elections and multiple competing parties? Some authorities on the matter like to say that this is the recipe for democracy, but most of us would probably agree that it is insufficient. After all, parties can be captured by private interests, ballots can be manipulated, or the entire electoral system could be structurally designed to exclude actual popular input. Another common approach is describing societies as having democratic values and norms, which are then ostensibly translated into formal political and judicial processes. This is certainly a better understanding, as it reflects ingrained attitudes and perspectives of an entire society, rather than vacuously describing the letter of the law. However, we are ultimately displacing the central concern. If democracies are characterized by societies with democratic values, then what exactly are democratic values? Much has been written about supposedly democratic countries and their shared values. In the field of political science, the so-called democratic peace theory is one of a few consistent postulates that is treated virtually as a law. The theory goes that democracies do not fight wars with each other because their governments are more accountable, the public is generally wary of conflict, and the societies share a common set of values. Democratic peace theory has found considerable statistical support through decades of study. Such observations about democracies extend into a broader social discourse, where it is said that citizens of democratic nations abhor all forms of oppression and injustice. Conversely, the same people will often claim citizens living in autocratic societies have a predisposition to authoritarian methods. The Russians, for instance, are supposedly a people that prefer a ruler with an iron fist. One can imagine that such characterizations quickly reduce themselves to banal colonialist dogma about the superiority of Western democracies, and the countries that strive to emulate them, over the regressive autocracies of the East. Though it may be obvious to most of you watching this video, these sentiments are desperately under-problematized in the Western mythos. How true is it that the American society has been fundamentally freedom-loving and democratically inclined? Certainly the US has a rich history of popular movements for emancipation, enfranchisement, and liberation. But parallel to this history is one of slavery, genocide, segregation, white supremacy, and imperialism. To this day, the national psyche of the country elevates the ultra-rich above the ordinary, and posits that those who have almost nothing deserve their lot in life. is a society that necessitates unemployment for economic efficiency and punishes the homeless for merely existing in public truly freedom-loving? While the majority of Americans struggle to make ends meet, socialized services and collective bargaining continue to be villainized by some of the loudest voices in the political arena. This is to say nothing about the January 6th coup attempt and the nearly half of the country that seems eager to embrace fascist slogans. In her book, White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America, Nancy Eisenberg details how the founders of the United States were often staunchly opposed to any semblance of democratic governance. The early governors of the colonies styled a society so rigid in its class makeup that one might best describe it as a hierarchy of castes. Puritan settlers punished individuals for wearing clothing above their station and enforced rigid social roles at birth. The colonies regularly depended on slave and coerced labor, often legislating class boundaries in a way that made them insurmountable. John Locke envisioned a new nobility and serf class in the colonies. Thomas Jefferson promoted social engineering and eugenics. Benjamin Franklin sought to curb class division by way of endless territorial expansion. The most important figures of early American history had their differences, but they were all united under the common banner of contempt for the poor. None of the above demonstrates an unwavering commitment to democratic values. To be clear, the point here is not to condemn the American people in a broad sense. Much of the progress that has been made took the sacrifice and tireless effort of activists, revolutionaries, organizers, and the public itself, which has tended to overwhelmingly support pro-social policies. Rather, the idea is to challenge the notion that there is something special about the American or even the Western psyche. The myth of the West's democratic roots is just that, a myth that has been carefully repeated over the centuries. A society that offers the public practically no control over the workplace or the economy, and limited control over the political structures, is not only far from being a democracy, but is quite far from being democratic. By contrast, it is similarly misguided to describe a national mythos as ahistorically authoritarian. How can we describe the Russian people as fundamentally authoritarian when the October Revolution was one of the most explosive and transformative revolutions in human history? How can the Chinese people be predisposed to hierarchical politics if not even a lifetime ago they fought a cataclysmic civil war to destroy all vestiges of feudal oppression? Such dramatic historical events beg the question, from where do the people draw a profound desire for emancipation if their national culture is undemocratic? There are a number of obvious responses to these thoughts. For one, there are no monolithic national cultures. There is no uniform affinity for freedom over order. These characterizations are sloppy historical work that omit important caveats and counterpoints. There are democratic and authoritarian tendencies in all societies. Democracies can be unexpectedly authoritarian, and despotic regimes can contain within them surprising horizontalism. Rather than ahistorical national cultures, there are evolving institutions and norms that are overdetermined by complex, material processes. Only the ebb and flow of the constituent elements of these complex systems can explain how a democratic society could give birth to an authoritarian one, and vice versa. The persistent characterization of a democratic and authoritarian camp serves ideological interests. Oftentimes, democracy is a thinly veiled substitute for Western liberal polity, complete with the racist colonial tropes about civilizational sophistication in the face of Eastern despotism. Insisting that the West is democratic also works as a legitimizing mantra. Democracies mean accountability and popular rule, implying that the people have chosen the status quo. Conversely, any authoritarian regime cannot be popularly legitimate by definition. This works as an added layer of political justification for the democratic bloc. Embargoes, interventions, and invasions are a lot more palatable if you can convince the public that the government in question has no popular support. The result is a tale as old as time, or at least as old as imperialism. The civilized camp is morally superior and bears the burden of civilizing their non-compliant counterparts. Of course, the banner of democracy is happily dropped if the autocrat in question happens to favor the interests of foreign capital. The U.S. had no problem supporting the Marcos regime in the Philippines, but could not abide by Assad in Syria. Pinochet was a fine ally, but Gaddafi had to be removed. Ultimately, where it is used, this civilizational categorization becomes a favorite of policymakers, both for its value in justifying the domestic circumstances and for its utility as a foreign policy instrument. We should not allow ourselves to be fooled by this primitive sleight of hand. The sooner we can acknowledge that most of the supposed democracies in the world are barely democratic, the sooner we can work towards higher standards. Democracy should mean truly popular control over both politics and economics. It should require a deeply embedded commitment to public welfare and management of a collective future. Until we have done away with exploitation, discrimination, imperialism, and oppression of all forms, we should think twice about calling ourselves democratic.